Thank you very much, Alex. Can I just check you can see my presentation all right? That's good. Excellent, good. Yes, thank you very much. Delighted to be speaking at this 8th Future of English Language Conference. It's absolutely fabulous. The talks so far have been quite amazing. I hope you enjoyed the session this morning. So my interest, as Alex said, is very much about teacher education. And just to place myself in context, I started as an English language teacher working in a secondary school, and I've worked in schools, in primary schools, secondary schools, further education, and at university level as well. And throughout all of these experiences, I've been really fortunate to work with a number of very, very good teachers and to observe some amazing teaching. And I'm really interested about how we can maximize those opportunities for good teaching. And that's why partly why I'm really interested in teacher education, my role at Trinity, but also really interested in this way we can help teachers be better. And really this is what this talk is all about, looking at how we can use in-service training, training that teachers do when they're already practicing teachers, to help them notice things, to help them be better at what they do, to help students meet their educational goals. So that's really what I'm all about, what this talk is about. And specifically, we're going to be looking at one in-service program and the impact we've analysed on that particular program. So the structure of the session this morning, we'll just start with a couple of perspectives on CPD, looking at what we mean by teacher cognitions. We'll then take a look at the role of materials use and the materials that teachers use in the classroom as a vehicle to help teachers structure an analysis of their practice and their development. Then we'll actually go into the explaining about the case study, the impact study that we're doing with NILE, the development organisation based out of Norwich, with the Trinity Certificate for Practising Teachers qualification. And then we'll report back on these early findings. And as Alex says, we'll have time for questions. So if you do have any questions or comments, pop them in the chat or the Q&A, and we can deal with those at the end of the session. So let's just jump in and say, so CPD, in-service CPD, some perspectives. And I think if we've only worked in one or two institutions, it might be easy for us to think that all CPD is the same as that which we experience. But in reality, CPD varies greatly from sector to sector. University, private education, it could be for secondary education. It really does change in countries as well, and different perspectives, and what the kind of impetus of the local authorities or government, what kind of goals they have in supporting teachers or focusing teachers' attention on certain areas. So we'll take a look at some of these things, and certainly one of the, I think, most important things to establish right from the beginning is that learning to teach is not something you do once. It's not something you do your initial teacher education program, and that could be a PGCE or it could be a PGDIP if it's a university type qualification, or a CertPT or CELTA in the English language teaching environment. You don't just stop there. Learning as a teacher continues throughout your whole life, and that's a very, very important point to remember, that it's an initial teaching qualification that teachers start with. We need to just build on that, and there are our experiences, even from childhood and being a student in a classroom, really impact how we teach, impact our beliefs. Lorty, in his seminal 1975 Apprenticeship of Observation, talked a great deal about this. And indeed, when I think about my experience as a student, there are many things I know that I do now as a teacher as a result of seeing something that happened when I was a student. One example, I remember a maths teacher I had, Miss Jeffries was her name, and she wanted to demonstrate that one way of doing an equation, a quadratic equation it was incorrect. So she demonstrated this incorrect way on the chalkboard, and then there was the correct way she put underneath it. But very quickly, she put a big line through the incorrect one, and she just kind of said to herself, I never like to have incorrect versions of equations on the board so that people don't get misled. And I remembered that as a really interesting example of being very clear about having correct and incorrect examples of the target learning for students to see. And it's something I like to do in my own teaching, and teachers do that generally, but that's something that sticks with me. So this idea of learning to teach really is this ongoing experience from childhood right through our experiences that we have now. Also, we know that in-service CPD is absolutely essential if we're going to get better as teachers. We can do it by ourselves, but it's so much faster and better and more helpful for students if we can collaborate with peers. We can do courses run by knowing others, and often it's very helpful to have to complete a qualification, because that really formalizes learning. It pushes the teacher that bit more to try and attain that kind of educational development that an in-service course can do. I should say that with these references I'm giving, as is normal, the references are all on the last slide. So when this talk is available online, you'll see the list of references, as indeed at the end of the talk, if you want to take a picture, then the references will all be there in full. A further thing to note is that in the state sector especially, that CPD tends to be quite top-down, it's quite administrational. I remember when I was working as an English language teacher in a private language school, the CPD would generally be whatever the local trainer who worked at that school thought was interesting, and really that's what our CPD comprised of. I was a very young teacher, so whatever CPD about pedagogy they did was generally very beneficial for me. But then when I was working in the state sector, I suddenly found that the CPD wasn't about pedagogy. It wasn't about meeting learners' needs. It was suddenly very administrational, or the local government or the national government had introduced a new policy, and that meant we had to make certain changes in our lesson plans, or we had to make certain changes in how we announced information to students, or we conducted registers. And it was a very different type of CPD, administrational CPD, very important for the running of the school and of course wider educational context. But it wasn't really that pedagogical in focus. And this is something quite common in state sector CPD generally. There is, of course, areas for pedagogical support, but not as much as might be beneficial. And this final thing to note is that studies show that one very good way to help teachers develop and reflect on their practice is to use a tool, use something to help them reflect, use some kind of vehicle. And materials development and the use of materials is a really, really good way to help teachers develop their practice, because materials are something we go into class with all the time. And if we think about the talk earlier just on AI and how we might use AI to develop materials that we use in the classroom, the kind of prompts we put into AI, that will affect the output, and we need to learn about what those prompts are. We need to be critical about the output that we get, and all of that criticality that we need to apply. That will we need to learn how to do that. So generally, it's a nice, from overview perspectives, just to give ourselves a nice base starting point. I'm going to talk a little bit about now the teacher cognitions and its relevance to CPD, and just explain a little bit about this idea of teacher cognitions and indeed what teacher cognitions are. So basically, it's this unobservable point about teaching. It's our beliefs, what we know, what we think as teachers. Thinking back to that example I gave of my maths teacher, Miss Jeffries, when I was 14 or 15 years old, and this point about being very clear with what we display and making sure that if we do display an inaccurate example, we need to be very clear that it is an inaccurate example. Or if we believe that drilling is particularly helpful for developing pronunciation, or use of the phonemic chart is particularly helpful for pronunciation. These are our beliefs, and they will impact what we prepare for our lessons and what we deliver for our lessons, and therefore impact on our learners as well. And we know that this generally broad agreement, this nice quote from Clark here, is that it's an eclectic aggregation of cause and effect propositions from many sources. I think that's a lovely phrase, eclectic aggregations of cause and effect. That example from my math teacher, the day-to-day teaching that we do, there are things, oh yeah, if I do this, X is going to happen. So this all influences our beliefs, this ongoing idea that our beliefs and our experience and our knowledge are shaped in an ongoing basis. We don't just stop. And indeed, we take a slightly more philosophical approach to it. We know certainly the belief in terms of social capital, or the capital, we have the pedagogic capital that we have. So Bourdieu was, of course, talked about what to say, of course, Bourdieu and Passeron, French philosophers, looking at habitus and teachers' beliefs and how they're formed, really noticed how there was this ongoing development. Basically, it didn't stop. There's this bi-directional influence between teachers and their environments, the students they're in. And this all contributes to forming our belief system, which means that if we're going to kind of explore this point about teacher cognitions, we really need to be looking at teachers' experiences, their context. We need to be looking at all of this if we're going to see how we can identify what teachers' cognitions are, what their beliefs are, and then, once we know where they are, maybe where they want to be, where we can help them improve. So in terms of studies into teacher cognition, but generally, and Simon Borg has done huge amounts of research into teacher cognition, we know that studies are international in scope. They're quite directive. There's these non-probability samples. So it's with targeted cohorts of teachers. Generally, it's with language teachers, foreign language teachers working in state institutions. The number of participants is generally quite small. This is often because of teachers needing to volunteer for studies. They're generally qualitative in nature rather than quantitative. So, and they're really quite focused into context, because context is very, very important. Context is key in terms of teacher cognitions, because of that point about that eclecticism, which was Clark's comment earlier, or the Bourdieu belief about the bi-directional influence. And as I say, there's mostly introduced qualitative data, but there is some quantitative analysis along with that. But we're really looking at how we can get into teachers' experiences and help them see where they are in comparison to their peers and the wider professional context. So what does all of this tell us? What have studies in teacher cognitions told us? Well, let's find out a little bit about, we know that these studies have told us that materials are a really important influence. We've got the classroom experience, the interaction with learners, that's really high, but also, of course, the materials. And we know that one thing about textbooks that teachers use, they have developed incredibly over the years. From maybe the time when maybe once there was one course book or textbook that everybody used in all their classes, there is a fabulous array of course books that teachers can use to support their learners. And within those course books, we don't just have the course book or a teacher's book. There are tests, practice tests, there's online content, links to external sites, so much that publishers have done an amazing job of really supporting teachers with everything they need. However, in doing so, to kind of support teachers, they've also in some way kind of reduced the teacher's need to be creative. They've reduced the teacher's need to adapt materials to suit the local context. So there might be achievement tests and progress tests and workbooks and so on, but that's a kind of one-size approach designed by a publisher in maybe in a country very different from the country where the book is being used. So it still becomes very important for a teacher to adapt all of those resources that come, but the time to do that is limited, and the skill to do that is often not taught. So teachers maybe don't think they can't question course books, and the result is maybe that materials are often used in a way that's not intended by their designers. A very simple example is that you might have a school that is using a course book designed as a test preparation book. They might use that test preparation book as their main course book, but the test preparation book isn't necessarily a communicative language teaching book. It might not be aligned with the educational objectives of the students, or indeed the class. The book and the students' objectives might not be aligned, and so teachers might just think, well, here's a book, it's got all of these resources that we need, or maybe a school manager might say this, therefore we'll use this book. And the result is that you're preparing students for something which was not maybe the best way to prepare them. And this happens with many things, not just with course books, but for exams, but many other things as well. And as a result, teachers who are just starting out in their professional life often become very, very dependent on published materials. And that's no bad thing at the start, as long as this is developed. And again, I remember when I started teaching, I was using a book called Reward for a communicative language, English language teaching course book. And the Reward teacher's book was fantastic for me at the time as a brand new teacher. It told me when I needed to put students into pairs, when I needed to group students, different ways to get feedback. And it was itself a kind of in-service teaching for me after my initial qualification. The only problem was that that's how I thought teaching was. And I did that teaching from the style from that teacher's book all of the time. And it wasn't until later that I realized I needed to be critical with those techniques and be judicious in which techniques I used with different classes, different sizes, different levels, different nationalities of students. So it's still very important to have this criticality, but certainly the research into cognitions has told us that teachers' beliefs about teaching are shaped really strongly by those early years, and that there's a need, if they're going to develop and be better educators, there's a need for teachers to start being a little bit more critical with their work. So this one, as I say, one way that one thing we know about materials development in the development of teachers' cognitions is that we do need to be critical. As I mentioned, this criticality is absolutely key if we're going to be delivering learning which is appropriate to our learners' context and meeting our learners' individual needs. We also know that when there is a focus on materials development, there is a demonstrable enhancement in teachers' knowledge and practice. And there are different ways, of course, we can include materials development, and there are lots of provisos within that. And we'll talk a little bit about how we, in a moment, how we can identify some of those things in a bit more detail. We also know that ongoing CPD, especially when it's linked to certification, and as part of that, we also mean assessment, is generally much more effective than one-off development activities, workshops, conferences, etc. Now, conferences like this are excellent at sharing information. Conferences like this are excellent about learning about new things that are happening, learning about other perspectives, building on our broader educational context. However, they're not so good, conferences like this, at developing our day-to-day teaching activity, because we don't have a chance to interact, we don't have a chance to practice something. That development of teaching skills is most effective when it's over a period of time, there's opportunities for reflection, teachers have a chance to learn and internalize the learning and professional development activity. So that's some other things about what we know about materials development and CPD and teacher cognitions. So I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about how this has informed the impact study that we're conducting with NILE. So NILE, the Norwich Institute for Language Education, based in Norwich, but global online CPD provider, and the impact study we're currently running with them for the CertPT. So the CertPT, I mentioned this qualification, Certificate for Practicing Teachers. What is it? Well, this is Trinity's suite of teacher education qualifications. You're on the left-hand side, you see the titles, the CertTESOL. That's the initial essential teaching qualification for those working in English language environments. In the state sector, of course, public schools are different. There's the TILEC, a young learner specialist qualification, the certificate in online teaching, a relatively new certificate for helping teachers develop the skills for working in an online environment, CertPT, and then the DipTESOL. DipTESOL, a master's level diploma in teaching. But the CertPT, as you'll see there, is let's highlight that. So a level 6 qualification, which means it's like a final year undergraduate qualification. It's quite short. There's only minimum 30 hours of input. We would say it takes about 100 hours in total to complete the whole qualification. And it's about this focus on specialist development relevant to teachers' contexts. So this is what the qualification we're looking at, and the impact this in-service qualification has on teachers' cognitions and therefore their actions in the classroom. So a bit more about the CertPT now. That's where it is in the general structure or general framework. We look at the NILE courses. So NILE run a number of very good in-service training courses. So on young learners, teenagers, materials development, many, as you see the list here, and they've just added, I think, aviation English. I think started a few weeks ago as well. So they have this as training courses with no formal assessment or no formal qualification. It's typical in-service CPD. But for those that want to, teachers can then opt in for concurrent certificate for practicing teachers input and support. So it goes at the same time. You've got your kind of main thread of professional development in, let's say, teaching young learners, and then there's a thin thread along the top which helps teachers use that knowledge in completing the assessment tasks required for the certificate for practicing teachers. And well, what are those assessment tasks? Well, there are 4 assessment tasks of the CertPT, and they're all based around materials development and use. The first one is about materials evaluation, evaluating materials relevant to the context that the teacher has. That context could be young learners or testing or developing teacher educators. There's then a task which requires materials adaptation, materials creation, and then the reflection in use of materials. So that's how the qualification, the 4 assessment tasks fit in with the training. So this optional bolt-on. So it's the CertPT isn't the course in itself, it's the qualification which comes at the end of a CPD course. But it makes teachers focus on the use of materials in order to develop those teacher cognitions. So our impact study aims, we had 2 aims. One was to evaluate the impact of assessment tasks, that explicit materials focus, and the other was also to look at the alignment between NILE's courses and the CertPT. So we're just going to look at the first one here. That's the most relevant for us for this particular session. And the method that we did, this is what we've done. So we started with, of course, literature reviews, recruiting participants, where about 2/3 of the way through this particular study, we should be finishing in the autumn this year. But where we are at the moment, we've finished our second interviews with course participants. So for an impact study, we start with collecting data before the start of the course. At the end of the course, we then collect data again, and then we wait for 3 to 4 months afterwards, and we have a third interview with teacher participants to interview them and find out, to assess the impact of the qualification and the course on their day-to-day practice. We also interview NILE trainers as well. So that's where we are. We're just at the stage of really getting into the analysis, but we're now able to report on some early findings, some really fantastic things that are coming out already for this impact study. So if we start by looking at the assessment tasks, so there's 4 assessment tasks of evaluating a resource, adapting a resource, creating a resource, and then using one of the adapted or created resource, and then getting reflecting on it as a vehicle for development. They're the 4 tasks, and we've found that the effect on teacher cognitions is not just positive, it's strongly positive. And so we have, so what we have found is that with the framework that we have, we've enabled teachers to accept the need to be critical about the materials based on their context, and an understanding that criticality based on context is really, really important. We can be critical, but it doesn't really mean anything unless we base it in a particular context. So making sure that teachers' local environments are considered is absolutely important, and that's really key in the assessment criteria that we have for the CertPT. We also have found that the CertPT gives teachers confidence in being able to question materials. So many times teachers are told to use X book and go through units 1 to 10, and they must do all of the units, and they must do the book as it is. As we might imagine, this can be problematic as the book isn't published for a particular set of students. We need to question, we need to adapt that material. And many times teachers don't have that confidence, but we found that after the course and qualification assessment, teachers are able to have that greater level of criticality. It also helps teachers experiment and give them the confidence to use their own materials to support learners' needs. And it also helps teachers become aware of learner voice. This was something I will admit we weren't expecting from the study. And this is because the final assessment of the CertPT requires teachers to get feedback from their learners on how they themselves as teachers are using the materials. And the teachers have been really inspired, I think, by the responses from learners about how aware they are of what good teaching is. And if we think back to that example of Miss Jeffries, my math teacher, that apprenticeship of observation, Lotie's point, our students are learning about teaching as we're teaching. So this is a really, really fabulous thing. It's helping teachers be aware of the role learners have in the interaction in the classroom. We also, so that was the assessment tasks, the impact of the assessment tasks. We've also got some really excellent data on the impact of the assessment criteria for which the assessment tasks to the CertPT are assessed. So first point is that it requires teachers to think about areas they haven't thought about before. So for example, the wider professional context, endpoint requirements. Often you get teachers who are in our teaching situations, especially maybe with younger or newer teachers, they will they'll get their book and they'll have a set of lesson plans and they'll do those lesson plans, and maybe they're not that consciously aware of what the aims of a particular course are. Could be even be like a secondary school year. What are the aims for the students at the end of the year to pass an exam? But beyond that, what's that exam? What are those learning aims? What is the end relationship? What's the end output? So starting to think more about the alignment between aims, planning, activities, assessment. That this is the qualification assessment criteria have really helped teachers become more aware of how important that is if we're going to be truly critical to support our learners. It's also helped teachers remember many of the things from their pre-service training, which they've forgotten about when it comes to doing day-to-day teaching. And that if you do just have materials you can use all the time, or maybe they're pre-prepared materials for a course, but we start to de-skill ourselves as teachers. We lose that critical ability to teach as teachers, to maybe become automatons or instructors rather than teachers. And if we're going to teach, we need to know how best to support our learners. And that's often, of course, we know that because we know the underlying theory. So it's helping teachers, we know the assessment criteria help make teachers become more aware of what they're doing and why they're doing it, and perhaps what that kind of underpinning reason is. Of course, as an assessment which is at a kind of finally undergraduate level, so level 6, teachers who have masters can do it, but it's just this focus at the level is at level 6. At level 6, there is a requirement to engage with literature, wider reading, just a little bit, but there is some. And so it helps teachers move on from the theory of their pre-service learning and start, which is often quite general in approach, start to target areas of interest, pedagogical areas of interest, and the literature around that for their local context, what the teaching they're doing in that kind of day-to-day basis. So it's helping give them teachers that educational knowledge that will really support them in their practice. And as well as this, it does that we found that the assessment criteria have helped teachers understand more about what it is to pass an assessment. At Trinity, we're very, very keen to ensure that assessment criteria is as explicit and as possible, so everyone can see. There's nothing to hide. We want teachers and everyone to see what the assessment is and how they're being assessed. And by taking this approach, we have teachers are realizing that when they're supporting their learners with writing academic texts, there are certain things, features that need to be included for good practice in academic texts. And there's a washback from the assessment criteria to teachers' knowledge and beliefs, which is now, which for their students is now affecting them. So some really, really positive points. So overall, we see some really strong elements of impact. And this is just from the first set of analysis. We've got a second set of interviews taking place in, third set of interviews in July and August, which will give us our final set of data to really round out this. So hopefully we'll be able to report back on that final data. But I'm going to share some quotes from some of the research participants, teachers who, these practicing teachers. The first one, I won't read these out, I'll just be quiet and let you read them. I really love this one about materials not being put on a pedestal, but there's a kind of a pedestal, like a high place, something that can't be touched. The idea of putting something on a pedestal, a bit idiomatic in expression, is that it's an exemplar, it's something of perfection. But new teachers do think this. The course book is king. However, through enabling teachers to be critical, they realize they can adapt it. The course book isn't king. That they are king or queen of their contexts, and they are the ones that should be able to decide what's best for their learners. This was a really nice quote from someone who was working in refugee and asylum seeker contexts, where the assessment required some the resource being used required some adaptation, and that was task 2, and she involved the students in that development, and through integrating student feedback and student experiences, she was successful in helping learners who were in a very difficult situation. It was refugee camps in southern Europe. She still works in, and she said that she was able to create a sense of community, and that she hadn't realized of the power of the classroom and what we do in the classroom and the experiences from learners we build into the classroom in building that sense of community, taking it beyond just the day-to-day learning objectives of by the end of the lesson, the learners will be able to use past continuous to talk about X. No, there was more than that, this community integration. So this was a really nice quote coming from one participant. As I say, the criteria, what we require, what Trinity require participants of the CertPT to do is to question things they might not have questioned before. And materials evaluation is the vehicle for this. And so one participant, this participant working in Mexico, saw the material they were using from a completely new place, and it made them more aware. I think it was T.S. Eliot, I think, who said something like, "You spend all your life traveling." I'm paraphrasing. I can't remember the exact, but you spend all your life traveling, and then you end up coming back to the same point. But when you come back to the same point, you appreciate that point ever so much more than you did when you left. because of your experiences. You've learned so much more. And I feel there's something like this. You can go around and you keep doing the same, using the same materials, but maybe how you use them, how you apply them, how you understand them will be greatly different because of all of those experiences, and crucially, better informed to support our learners. Final quote, I've nearly finished, is, here we are, I'll let you read this final quote. This was a really nice one where one of the teachers was quite liked creating materials, but maybe created them more because of their own kind of interests and a very general kind of leveling point. But they realized that actually if the materials are going to be truly effective, they need to relate to the learners. And that context, which we require teachers to focus on and become aware of, is almost like a social needs analysis of interest for learners. So it's not just the language that we need to take into consideration, but we need to know the learner's interests as well and build that into materials to make sure that they're effective and or that they're happy with their learning, and indeed they're fully engaged. So there are some really nice quotes from the participants of the study. So the next steps, let's say, where we've completed the second set of semi-structured interviews with course participants. We've interviewed the course trainers as well. We've got our, we're now in a kind of 7 to 9 section in the table there. So we're starting to analyze the output as well from course participants' assessment. This will help us triangulate the data and the findings from the qualitative interviews. And then there'll be further qualitative text analysis, which will help us identify those emergent themes and find out from the teacher's own narratives what it is that's helping them be better as teachers. And when we know that, well, we can start to think, well, how effective are materials in that development? What further things can we do to target teachers' professional development? So the final slide now, just some implications for CPD. I think certainly if we think about this idea of developing teacher cognitions, there are several things we need to think about. Creating a space to create a space to question accepted practices. Teachers need to be critical. Materials are a really effective way of helping teachers reflect on what they do and make it better. It's something quite tangible, a resource. You can move things, you can move questions about, change pictures even. There's something very physical about it that it isn't so conceptual. So it's really quite a tangible piece of professional development. We also know that if to enable teachers to reflect, we need things like frameworks to help teachers work within and knowing other, we might say. And we also know that by reviewing the past, reviewing the teaching that we have done, the materials that we have used, this can be as effective, if not better sometimes, than preparing for the future, because it gives us a real point of experience to reflect upon. So that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much. Here are the references. These will all be available, of course, online afterwards. And now, if we have, I think we've only got 3 minutes left, Alex. I was a little long with that, but I hope that wasn't too much. But thank you very much. I'll now try and stop sharing my screen.